I'm really happy to be here today with Alan and Jackie Gear, who worked with the organisation for many years, from 1974 to 2003, and of course as executive directors from 1985, I guess. So are really instrumental to the development of the organisation through all those years. And we're going to start by talking about the role that the members experiments really had within the organisation over the different years. I don't know if you could start by explaining really from the very early years.
Well, the problem for the organisation and for Lawrence was that although the philosophy of organic growing was understood, the practice wasn't, and from a gardening perspective there was a lot of what could have been called old wives' tales about how to do things, and the important thing was to work out what worked and what didn't work. And for Lawrence, working on his own, he hit on, and with no resources to speak of, he hit on this brilliant idea of involving the membership of the organisation in carrying out the experiments, which also had the added bonus of meaning that he could get experience of growing in different locations, on different soils, in different climatic areas. So you have a broad spread of experience. And over the years that were at Bocking, there were a huge number of experiments that filtered out but basically what worked, what didn't work. And when we got to Bocking in 74, there were two main strands. There was the work done on the trial ground, and there was the work done in the members' experiments. And basically the trial ground experiments were ones that were on the whole more complicated and long lasting. For instance, there were some very long running trials comparing fertiliser use with compost that ran over 10-15 years. Well, that's something you couldn't do with the members. And some of the other things that he tried were perhaps more sophisticated, members couldn't do. But generally speaking, the way it would work is that a member might send in an idea, or Lawrence would come up with an idea. We'd have a year trialling it out at Bocking to see if it looked as though it had got legs. And then if it had, we would make it into a members experiment, and then we get that much broader focus of whether it worked or not.
Yeah, that's great. And then, so during those early years, it was very much, so it was the work of the organisation really centred around the members experiments, didn't it? And but not only about undertaking the experiment, it was also about communicating the results to. I mean, Lawrence, had a column in the Observer, didn't he, where he actually was able to write about the trials.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, Lawrence had a real way with words, as you know. He wrote lots of books, and he was a journalist. And his articles or pieces would be war on weeds, pest control without poisons. But just very, very good at getting the message across.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And given that he was a one-man band, he was just as Jackie said, as a journalist, he had a real eye for what would catch the press's notice. So he would just come up with crazy stunts. I remember
a jump-in. He used to call them jump-ins.
When he'd just try and get something in the press. But for instance, at one point he'd been working on ways of encouraging hedgehogs to remain in your garden. And he wrote a book called Operation Tiggywinkle, after the Beatrix Potter name, and he got this was something that the BBC loved the idea of, and they came along and filmed, except that there was no hedgehog at the time in the garden to film, so they brought along a stuffed hedgehog, and it was somebody's job to actually move this hedgehog around a bit to make it appear to have a little bit of life. But that was just the sort of thing that he was able to do in order to get the the story into the press. That of course encouraged more people to write in, who became members, who then did more experimental work. So the whole thing grew rather like a slow-moving snowball throughout the 60s
and it was
70s.
It was slow as well, in as much as when people used to send their results in, there'd be pages and pages of people just talking on paper. So for me as a scientist, to get to the gist of the scientific stuff inside was quite difficult. So I suggested that we had a proper form that people filled in, but which we did. However, we didn't want to lose all the information that they might, be into something with a throwaway remark. So we still had to go through all the stuff. And this was first thing in the morning when the mail would come in. We'd be sitting on Lawrence and Cherry's bed, opening the mail and looking and talking, and as if it was the most natural thing in the world to be looking at all these scientific results potentially sitting around their bedside. It was a most amazing time.
And many of the experiments sort of turned into much bigger campaigns almost, didn't they, at that time, going out to the national press and really engaging with many people outside the membership, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, when we arrived, he had just launched a campaign called Dig for Survival. And it was at a time when there was more of a move back to people growing things on allotments. And there was more concern about self-sufficiency, people being more self-sufficiency at home. And the question there was, how much could you grow in your little garden plot? How much food could you grow? And if you look back to the old gardening books on yields, they were very variable. So this was an obvious opportunity to get members to weigh things in their gardens, to actually try and establish a much closer view as to what would be the optimum things to grow.
What spacing they would use.
What spacing, how close could you go, what would be the best times to grow. It's a huge thing, really. And side by side with that, Lawrence was also running a program of trying to come up with storable proteins. We're all urged these days to cut down on meat and eat more beans. Well, we were doing that in 1976.
55.
And we were looking at soya beans that might grow in the country, or agricultural feed beans and
lentils,
all manner of things. And again, you really needed the spread of members' experiments to see, well, can you grow soya bean or lentils up in Yorkshire? Maybe you can in Cornwall. Do these things grow in Wales? And you need that spread. And as those results came back, they were incorporated into successive editions of Dig for Survival. So we were gradually coming up with more and more accurate information as to what you might expect to grow in the garden.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see all that's come back again today, the interest in that, and a sort of a food security agenda, that we all want people not necessarily to be self-sufficient, but to be more part of the food production system, and even knowing what's the potential of food production on a small scale, and also, as you say, introducing all these protein crops and trialling them all.
Well, we even grew wheat to see if people could grow their own wheat, but the birds got to it the day before we were meant to.
The birds harvested it.
But that was never going to work on a scale.
But there were some broader issues as well. I mean, one of the things that was really exercising environmentalists back in the 1970s was lead in petrol and the effect of roadside lead on children. And Lawrence teamed up with Professor Derek Bryce Smith at Reading University, and he recognised that with Lawrence as members, he could get samples of, say, dust in people's houses from people who lived in the country, people who lived next to major roads and so on. And also crops they grew in the gardens. At one point, Lawrence was getting people to grow cabbages in their front garden and their rear garden to see what the lead contamination was.
That was how we got in touch, or rather Lawrence got in touch with us in the first place, well, with me, because I was running my water pollution control laboratory. And he contacted me to see whether I would send some sewage sludge samples to see whether they had lead in them. I said, well, I don't think they will, because it was in a rural area on the Dower coast, and but he was interested in lead.
There was a lot of work on.
And when the energy crisis came, we started doing work on biofuels. Again, years and years before anybody else was, and members would receive clones of willows that were grown at Long Ashton Research Station. It's gone now, but in Somerset, and try them out in their gardens and see how fast they grew, and it was all measured and recorded. I mean, it was a huge corpus of work. I suppose one problem with it was that Lawrence had an absolute scattergun approach. I mean, his mind was here, there and everywhere, and so in a sense we were probably trying to do too much, and so a lot of experiments came in, and if you were doing it, if you like, strictly by the book, you would run it over 6 or 7 years and do it. Well, with Lawrence, if it didn't show promise after a couple of years, that's it. It was just dumped.
He was on to the next story.
Well, I was just going to say, and the thing about that meant that, I suppose, although it was not, if you like, strict science, it was pretty indicative of whether something was practical or not. So by having a lot of subjects, a lot of topics, we did cover a lot of ground: soil improvement, composting, pest control, novel crops, a range of things. So by the time we left Bocking, we'd actually done a hell of a lot of work, really.
But every one of them was important. One I remember with fondness is Give Up Smoking Bonfires. Was one.
A campaign,
He and Cherry Hills, his wife, were way ahead of their time. Way ahead.
Just recognising the pollution from bonfire. And now here we are in, today, and they're talking about the problems of wood smoke and wood burners.
The only thing we had to be careful about was that his plot sizes on the controlled plots weren't always accurate.
Well, he was a one-man band. He was
wasn't a criticism.
No, he was trying to run the organisation, do the cultivation. It's I mean, that's why he got us in, didn't he? And later Pauline and the organisation.
And incredibly successful in terms of both building an organisation and building the knowledge around organic gardening.
Absolutely,
achieved that because by reaching out to people, the membership organisation really grew at that time, didn't it? And then there was obviously a big move in the 1985. We moved to Ryton, and the members' experiments took a slightly different role within the organisation then. And I have often said that that was of course when I was taken on, and I can remember the remit I was given by you, Alan, and I think it was Bill Blythe who interviewed me as well, said that I've got to make the science. I was taken on as a research coordinator, and my job was to make the science stand up to scientific scrutiny. And I've got to make it pay.
Absolutely.
And of course, at that time,
and you
citizen science. Well, I did, but citizen science wasn't really respected within the science community, and also you couldn't get external funding for gardening research at that time. So we sort of moved more to doing, I suppose, using more conventional scientific techniques. Although as we worked mainly on applied science, it was still participatory, but with farmers and growers rather than gardeners. So we worked more on I suppose research to develop or improve the techniques used by commercial growers.
But there's some of those could filter down to gardeners.
Absolutely. I mean, that was very much our remit, to do the research within commercial horticulture and then transfer.
Can I take you back though? I mean, we got to
I'll talk about the flea beetle.
No. Well, I can do but I wanted to keep it just a little bit broader for a minute. When we got to Bocking in 1974, and then we were there for 9 years before the move to Brighton, Lawrence was totally focused on experiments, and we were, as coming in with virtually no horticultural knowledge, we could see that also what was needed was demonstration. And we didn't get many people to the trial ground in Bockings, just on open days, and
about 100 people on an open day.
But it was clear that demonstration was important, but equally it was obvious that there were limitations with the Bocking site. It was only 2-3 acres, acre and a half, and it had no car parking, and
only had a compost loo, which even the secretarial staff wouldn't use.
And it was Jackie who decided, that if the organisation was really going to push the message out, we needed to create a national centre for organic gardening somewhere more central. And she persuaded the rest of the committee and the people on site that this was a good idea, and that's what started the search for Ryton. And we ultimately found that sort of 20-acre field in the middle of the Midlands that began the whole process. And part of that area was, as you say, a 5-acre field we could use for research, because it was not, again, in the 1970s, there were hardly any commercial organic growers. But by 1980, you'd had the first Organic Growers Conference, and it was obvious that there was absolutely no research. Peter Seger, who was one of the founding movers of the Organic Growers Association, said that he got his information from Lawrence Hill's book Grow Your Own Fruit and Vegetables, which was aimed at gardeners. So there was no real...
No. I think there are quite a few growers who of those really early pioneers who claim that that's exactly what they learned.
And what came through from those early growers meetings, which we were very excited about. Lawrence had always wanted to feed the world. He said, that's what we want, to feed the world. And we did too. Yeah. And so we didn't want to stop at gardening.
But what I wanted to do was be a sort of a leveller, because a lot of people in the organic movement were what I would call, wrongly these days I suppose, posh. Had lots of money. Yeah. And my remit as an ordinary working class girl who went to uni, I wanted organic vegetables and organic growing to be available, and organic food to be available to everybody.
Yeah.
Not just people who could afford to buy it from posh shops. Which you couldn't then.
No, that's right. And to make more of it, they weren't all going to grow it themselves either. So helping the commercial growers.
So doing the commercial research was absolutely, and down the line, we saw that as really important. And something that, and also not long after as well, we were doing work for, reforestating desert lands, because again.
Absolutely.
The third world, or developing world, whatever you want to call it, the people there can't afford pesticides and fertilizers, even if they wanted to. And so small scale growing in the tropics, that was something that we wanted to be able to influence. Not long after moving to Ryton, we set up an overseas division that did research into reforestating drought areas and how to advise people on growing in the tropics as well.
And I suppose it wasn't as much that the methodology for the research changed, because the members' experiments were of course continued throughout indeed. All of this. They had slightly less of a profile within the organisation, but it was still how we communicated and how we engaged with the members.
Absolutely.
And often the experiments were done on the back of other research, so it was a way of, as you say, applying the knowledge into gardening, and also using to test. I can remember us testing various green manures, for example, for field use. But it was a good way of seeing even where they germinated in different parts of the country.
Absolutely. Yeah. And things that were, the research that was done, say on. Peas and beans, which were used as green manures, the assumption always was that you dug those into the ground and the nitrogen in the nodules would affect the following crop. And work that was done at Ryton showed that was not really the case, that there was very little left.
Most of it is harvested if you harvest the peas and the beans.
Exactly.
But I think we wanted to, as well as doing the important work with the members, we wanted to make the membership bigger so that the message could spread. And that's why the demonstration gardens, and indeed the cafe and the restaurant and the shop, were important in that respect, educationally, because people could come to Ryton and taste one of our wholemeal organic scones and think, well, I can do that. I can do that at home. I can grow these vegetables just by looking at the no-dig garden. They may not have thought about that you could garden without digging. And the sensory garden, that even if you're blind, you can grow. And all these things were making gardening and organic gardening safe, environmentally friendly, healthy organic gardening available, accessible to people who came from all over the country, all over the world.
Which we were fortunate that we were able to spread that message really well. and the late 80s when we began the television series All Muck and Magic.
But they'd come to see us in Booking originally.
Yeah.
So and we had 3 series, and that was great. But so that was a really good way of disseminating the information. But having said that, I mean, I take my hat off to Jackie, because she was just a genius, really, at getting things out.
I just enjoyed myself.
Whether it be radio, TV clips, other than the series, or just stuff in the media generally. There were always journalists knocking at our door, wanting to know what we were doing.
That gave us more credibility on all levels, so that we could get more money. People would sponsor us, or even the government grant side. I think when you came to the work for the organisation, the combination of what we were doing and what you were doing, we got national credibility. Yeah, which we'd never had before.
Yeah, I mean, that was, of course, when the whole organic movement grew, and I feel very much that HGA was a very, very big part of that, and had a very big impact on it. Yeah. And it was, of course, recognising that I suppose the ultimate aim was to make everything, to make the world organic, and there are more ways of doing that than just doing research. I mean, that was essential, but it was the whole promotion, communication, making it relevant for people.
Exactly.
And I think that's what really happened when you sort of stepped in as chief executives and drove it forward at all different aspects, didn't it, really?